I recently found a book of Mishlei, a book of Proverbs that I had used as a child. It's more than 40 years old. And I gave it to my sons, to Eliel, Natan, and Yaron Eliav. And I told them, read this. This is very important. It's part of the Tanakh. And, learn from it because this is something that I learned from. And then Yaron, my second oldest son, told me that he would read it to his children. And that was very, very touching because he's only 7 years old. And yet he has a very deep understanding of the span of life, because then he added something which sort of took me aback for a little bit, and he said, I will read it to them when you are not there. And I told him sort of jokingly, seriously, I'm not planning to be anywhere anytime soon. I plan to be here, B'ezrat Hashem. But he understood that what I am teaching him is something that he can teach to his children, and that by doing so, it will link me with them. And God willing, that chain will continue. And it brought to mind a passage which I think is very important. It's from the book of Mishlei. I think it's chapter 19, verse 2. And it says, V'gam beloda'at nefesh lotov. And then it continues and it says, Ve'atz raglaim choteh. And it says, and also, it is not, the soul that does not have knowledge is not good. And those who effectively run, sin. There's another translation that's more popular, I guess you could say. It says something like, it is not good to have zeal without knowledge, or to be hasty and miss the way. And it's important because it doesn't mean that the individual doesn't have sincerity. It just means that the individual doesn't have the foundation that is necessary to succeed. And it made me think about a story, a true story, something that happened about 25 years ago. It's quite amazing how time passes. I was at a local shul, Young Israel, visiting, and there was a young man. I had seen him before. We had talked, and he was very sincere. He was very passionate, but he hadn't grown up religiously, and yet over a period of time, it seemed like a few weeks, he sort of transformed into this very religious-looking Jew. He could grow a lot of facial hair, so he had a huge beard very quickly, and he dressed in a suit and just sort of the sort of black hat type garb. And unfortunately, he hadn't gone through the basics. He hadn't said, hey, I need to study Hebrew. I need to learn the basics of the brachot. And so he was called up to an aliyah, and he couldn't complete it. I mean, the rabbi looked at him, and he was very upset with him because, here he was sort of giving off this image of being shomer mitzvot, and he couldn't complete the basic mitzvah of saying the bracha. And again, it wasn't because of lack of sincerity, because I talked to him, he was very passionate, but he sort of got ahead of himself. He looked to another place, and he wanted to be there without realizing that he had to sort of flourish in the level or at the place that he was at. And the reason that I mentioned this is because in this week's Parashat Bamidbar, we have the tribes situated around the Mishkan, around the tabernacle. And some of the tribes, as Rabbi Baruch Galman noted, are larger than other tribes. They're more prominent. Of course, we look at Judah. The tribe of Judah always stands out. We look at Ephraim. We look at certain tribes that are just more prominent in the biblical text, in the biblical story. And there are certain tribes that we don't know them as well. We may know them from the Midrashim or other stories. But in the biblical text, they serve sort of as a minor note, one might say. And that's not to belittle any of them, of course. But they know their place at this particular time. They know their station. And the goal, as Rabbi Baruch Gelman says, is for them to flourish in their station as it stands, not to sort of envy the position of another or the placement of another individual. Each one of them had a particular flag that signified the attributes of that tribe, and that was not simply for logistical purposes of telling them when to leave, when to march, and when to stay, but it was reflective of their identity. And it's important for each individual, just like it was for the tribes, to sort of emulate the best characteristics of what they stand for, or what they want to stand for. Now we see a breakdown of that in future generations. We see the friction that exists in Shoftim between the tribes that don't necessarily support the other tribes when they're under attack. We see Devorah when she gives her song of victory. She doesn't mention all the tribes. I think 2 or 3 of them are missing, which is indicative of a problem, is that they don't stand together, and that's one of the reasons that they're easily taken over by enemies at different times just because of in-house fighting, so to speak. And we see this again when Shaul is nominated as king, selected as king. There are some individuals that are not in support of him. Reuben is the smallest of the tribes, and he's selected, an individual from that tribe is selected to be the king. We see this later, of course, under Rehoboam with the division of the tribes. Now, there's certain reasons for that, but it's embedded in this kind of inter-tribal rivalry, this jealousy, this friction that exists. And of course, we have the two kingdoms that emerge from a united Israel. And the point that I'm trying to convey is very simple, is that we each have a particular plan that Hashem has established for us, a particular placement in our lives. And while we should aspire to grow in the place that we are, we should never envy the place of others. Just like the tribes knew where they were situated, they did not aspire to be in a different location. They desired to be the best that they could be in the place that Hashem had sent for them. And so I hope this for my children, and I hope those that are listening, that they will aspire to the best place that Hashem has given to them, and that they will reach the maximum expression of that in their lives.